Good morning or good day to everyone. This is Alan Fogwell. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Energy Research Institute. Welcome to our webinar. Our webinar today is about electricity versus fossil fuels, and we will get started in a few minutes, but let me go through a little bit of the logistics, and you should see it on the first slide. You can choose one of the following for audio, mic and speakers. You need to use VoIP for that. And if you want to dial in via telephone, there's a Canadian and US number and an access code that you have to punch in once you're on the system. As I mentioned, there's the audio options, and then in terms of asking questions, there's a question panel on your GoToWebinar app, and you can just type in the questions there and we will take them as they come up. We'll hold all the answers of the questions to the end. In addition, there you can get a copy of the presentation, can be downloaded from the handouts panel. So the Canadian Energy Research Institute, for those of you who don't know about our organization, was founded in 1975, so we've been around for almost 45 years. And we're an independent registered charitable organization, and we specialize in looking at energy economics and environmental impacts associated with energy production, transportation, and consumption. In addition to that, we hold a number of events, and we have quarterly market reports that come out on our website. Our organization wouldn't exist without funding support from various entities. Our core funders are Alberta government, the Government of Canada, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. We're also funded by the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, University of Calgary, Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, Alberta's Industrial Heartland, provinces of British Columbia and Saskatchewan, and the Ivy Foundation. Without those generous supports from those organizations, we wouldn't be able to do the kind of work we do, and we wouldn't be able to provide the information to you that we are going to give you this morning in this webinar. Now, I just wanted to touch on the title. It was electricity versus fossil fuels. And really what we're talking about today is electricity substitution. And we have a lot of uses of fossil fuels in our economy. We use it to drive our industry, we use it to drive ourselves, and we use it to keep ourselves warm and fed. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what happens if we didn't use fossil fuels for those activities, but rather used electricity. Then we're going to talk about the cost of the electricity energy services. And then finally, we want to address the issue of unanswered questions. Fossil fuels plays a huge role in Canada's economy, both domestically and for export. And if we're looking at replacing fossil fuels with electricity in certain services, there's a number of questions that need to be answered. Right now, they're not even being asked. So we're going to ask them, and hopefully we will be generating a fulsome discussion of electricity versus fossil fuels as we move forward in Canada and the different provinces as they debate their energy policies. So, electrification. This is replacing fossil fuels with electricity. We've heard a lot about electric cars, but that's only one tip of the iceberg in terms of what we talk about in terms of electrification. The focus on electrification is on the ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when we look at where greenhouse gas emissions are produced, much of them, or the majority of them, actually come from consumption. There's a lot of discussion in Canada today about the emissions that are generated in the production side of fossil fuels, but by far the largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions come from the consumption side. So it's you and I and our industries and our various commercial activities that create this need for energy, and therefore the emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, you'll see here in our analysis, what we did is we looked at the substitution of electricity for fossil fuels in a couple of different ways. There's, of course, the business as usual scenario where we want to just identify in our own models and our own analysis what that means for consumption, what that means for greenhouse gas emissions. And then we move towards what we consider are two scenarios related to electricity supply. One includes a high amount of renewables in the 60 to 75% range, and the other includes the high amount of renewables plus natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and storage. And in this case, the natural gas combined cycle is used to firm up the renewables. So those are two additional scenarios, scenario one and scenario two, that we looked at in terms of moving away from fossil fuels and towards electricity. In addition, when we consider just the transportation situation solely, we looked at 4 different cities in Canada. We looked at Halifax, at Ottawa, at Calgary, and at Yellowknife. And what we were trying to find there was if there's any difference across the country in terms of moving to different transportation scenarios, or if there's a difference between large and small communities. Keep in mind, Calgary is over 1 million, Ottawa is close to that, Halifax is small, and Yellowknife is even smaller. So we wanted to see if there was any significant difference between what was happening in larger centers versus what would be happening in smaller centers, and also what would be happening from the East Coast to the West Coast and to the north. One of the other things we wanted to look at in terms of the reduction in demand was making cities denser. We've had a lot of debate and discussion in this country about making our cities more dense, and so we wanted to test that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And I won't spoil the surprise, but it was an interesting finding that we weren't expecting. So I'll speak to that when we get there in the presentation. Also, we looked at alternative vehicles. So in this case, we're looking at battery electric vehicles. That's what BEV stands for. And fuel cell electric vehicles. That's what the FCEV stands for. In addition, the previous US administration brought in much more stringent CAFE standards for vehicles. And that is currently being debated, and it's on hold. But we wanted to test what the impact would be of these energy efficiency standards for vehicles in our overall assessment of greenhouse gases and energy demand. Vehicles form a major challenge for energy modelers and also people that are determining policy. And so what we needed to do is we needed to really identify what the stock vintage of our vehicles were. And you can see from this graph that we've got the stock vintages going right back to 1980 and out to 2050, and that the predominant share of vehicles is moving, in this case, would be moving away from gasoline and towards electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are much more efficient than gasoline vehicles. They're about 75% efficient versus a gasoline vehicle, which is 25% efficient. And that efficiency improvement makes an economic decision that much more forceful in terms of moving towards electric vehicles. But there are some caveats to that, and we'll get to that in a minute. When we looked at the 4 cities, we wanted to see if they were significantly different in terms of their current transportation modes. And you can see from the 4 cities that there isn't much of a significant difference. The biggest surprise actually was Yellowknife in terms of the amount of percentage of walking that takes place. But for the most part, we are concerned with the automobile and public transit, and you can see that we're in the range of 70 to 80 to 90% for the different cities. So there's not a significant difference between these cities in terms of their transportation infrastructure. Now, when we run the analysis looking at the penetration of electric technologies for different sectors, what you see here is the residential demand, and you can see that from a business as usual perspective, there would be a significant amount of natural gas and oil that's being used in different jurisdictions. We also see that when you talk about electrification, much of that disappears by the mid-2030s. That means that we see a much smaller demand for natural gas, and you can see that in Ontario and Saskatchewan and Atlantic Canada, that these demands for natural gas go down over time. So that leaves us the question is, what do we do with our natural gas companies? What do we do with our natural gas infrastructure? That's a question that needs to be answered, because there's a lot of investment in those activities, lots of assets that companies own. And what happens to those assets if we move towards electricity? Similarly, in the commercial sector, we see the same sort of thing, although in a lot of, well, at least in Atlantic Canada, there is already a lot of electricity that's used in the commercial sector. But where you look at Ontario and Saskatchewan in this example, we're looking at a significant amount of natural gas that would be substituted away from if we went towards electricity. Now here's an interesting point, and this comes back to my mention of densification. If you look at the purple line, we're talking about making the city 30% denser, which is a significant challenge in any city, making it that much more dense. And when you're talking about transportation emissions, it really doesn't get you much. So the idea that making cities denser is going to solve a significant problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is not correct. What you have to consider then is if you are going to go for densification, what would you do with the vehicle stock in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? And the alternative vehicles, which is our electric vehicles, either battery electric or fuel cell vehicles, shows a significant decrease from around 170,000 tons per in the early stages in 2020 to something below the 750,000 tons in 2050. What's also interesting about this is that the stringent CAFE standards actually provide a much better output in the early part of the analysis. Now, one thing we didn't include here was the federal government's move towards a clean fuel standard. That clean fuel standard would reduce the carbon intensity of liquid fuels as well as gaseous fuels, and that would just add to the reduction under the transportation scenarios. Now, the question is whether or not that reduction would be significant enough in order to get your greenhouse gas emissions targets lower, similar to alternative vehicles, and that's not likely going to be the case. It's going to be the case that the electric vehicles, either battery electric or fuel cell, will be a much more effective option for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. And when we look at that, we also have to consider the costs, and I will be coming back to the costs in short order. What I did want to show you is when we look at all the analysis that we've done in terms of moving away from fossil fuels towards electricity, we're seeing that there's still significant effort that needs to be made in order to meet some of the targets. And you can see here, we've got Atlantic Canada out to British Columbia. We didn't do the territories, but in 2050, for example, Quebec would reach 35% of its target. And if our targets are 80% below 2005 levels, 35% is not even half. We're talking here about much of the residential, commercial, and transportation sectors. It does not include the industrial sector, which is significant. But what this does tell you is that even with a very pervasive electrification policy, we are still far away from the federal government's target of 80% below 2005 levels in 2050. And that means, in addition to this significant effort that would be needed to be made to move away from fossil fuels towards electricity, that there's other things that need to be done as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the costs. And you can see from this slide, and I mentioned the different scenarios, that the cost of avoided greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the second column from the right, is $114 to $124 a ton. If you think about where we are right now in Canada, we're at around $30 a ton in terms of the carbon tax or a cap and trade cost. This would quadruple that amount in order to affect the changes that would be needed to move towards electricity and reduce our emissions. $124, $114, and in addition to that, we would see a significant increase in the price of electricity. So the average cost of electricity is going up 77%. Now that's above inflation. So 77% is above inflation. So we're assuming 2% inflationary price increases across the country every year to 2050, and then add on 77% on that. So is that going to impact affordability? It probably is. And then that means that governments and companies have to understand that this is going to be an issue that they have to address. One of the other things we wanted to look at is what it means in terms of the economic impact of moving towards electric vehicles. Canada right now employs 180,000 people in retail gasoline service stations. These jobs are entry-level positions that are provided to people to build their careers in the workforce. When we look at electric vehicles, we would be getting rid of most of these stations because much of the charging for vehicles can be done either at home or at the office. So in cities, we'd be seeing a significant decline, if not a complete elimination, of retail service stations. Now, that's not to say that some of them will not continue to exist. I'm sure there will be, but it also means that there's going to be job impacts and economic impacts in these cities. So looking at the 4 cities that we explored in some detail, we see that actually the job impacts in Halifax, Ottawa, and Yellowknife are net zero to positive. But the difference here is Calgary, and Calgary's job impacts would be about 1,100 people. And the reason for that is Calgary has a significant place in the development and production of fossil fuels. So these job impacts aren't necessarily related to the changing circumstances of what the cities are using for their energy. Rather, it's associated with the broader economic impacts. And you can see that Calgary's GDP would decrease by $220 million per year. Ottawa and Halifax and Yellowknife see an actual increase. And the reason for that is most of the time the electricity is generated much more locally than it is for oil and gas. That local activity means more jobs in those local communities. The oil and gas system is much more spread out. You have the supply centers far away from the demand centers, and that's why you don't see the same impact in Calgary as you do in Ottawa, Halifax, and Yellowknife. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that even if there's a net zero change in job impacts for those other three cities, there's still going to be a significant dislocation of about 85% loss in the retail sector, retail gasoline sector jobs. Now, here's another question. Are those people going to find employment in the electricity sector? Do they have the right kind of skills? And the likely answer to that is no. So while we could be gaining jobs in terms of the electricity system, we're going to be losing jobs in terms of the retail gasoline sector. And those jobs are not the same. And so the people won't be the same. So it does mean that we are looking at a significant adjustment in our workforce in order to be able to manage the change in jobs in the different centers if we move towards electricity and away from fossil fuels. One of the other points that we found in our analysis is that the move towards electricity is going to create a significant burden on our distribution systems. And this is just one example. And you can see that over time, the peak requirements in our systems go up significantly. These peak requirements are at least double. And that means that the utilities at the distribution level will have to make significant investments in order to manage the additional demand from both vehicles and from households. Here's another example, just looking at the peak demand growth over time. And just with one change to alternative vehicles, this is not including changing out your homes and businesses, just from the alternative vehicles themselves, you're looking at a 7 to 8-fold change in the winter peak demand. Now, keep in mind the one I showed you just before, which I'll just bring up again for a second, was looking at subdivisions and individual transformers. This one, the one for Calgary in general, is looking at the entire system. Again, we're looking at significant investments required to manage this growth. And one of the things that would be needed to be done in order to try and manage this growth would be to control when alternative vehicles can be charged up in your home. So next question is then, if we want to be able to manage the peak demand growth on the systems, do we want someone, either utilities or someone else, to have some control over when we can plug in our electric vehicles? Because if we don't, we need to match an uncoordinated demand, which this shows, which makes it quite significant and quite costly. Not only that, if we're talking about a lot more generation that's needed, we're looking at significant changes in our electricity grid. We're looking at an expansion of the electricity grid in ways that may not be accepted by a lot of people. In the case of Ontario, you're looking at more than a 200%, almost a 300% increase in the electricity demand requirements, and therefore you're talking about significant growth in generation and transmission. We already talked about distribution. This really focuses on generation and transmission. Now, some people have talked to me and said, well, you can do some of this with distributed energy resources. And the answer to that is yes, you can, but it also means a significant investment either on the demand side or on the supply side, and all of those costs are going to be part of our electricity bills going forward. Now here's the heart of the matter. So we've talked about moving away from fossil fuels towards electricity. Well, how will electrification impact affordability? I already talked about the cost implications that we've found, which have a 77% increase over inflation by the year 2050. And that doesn't include all the costs, that only includes the cost of the electricity system itself. Will we accept a significant need for intervention for electric vehicle charging? Or do you want to be able to plug in your vehicle when you go home at night? Or are you willing to wait until 3 in the morning when it can be done? Where are we going to get the money? How are we going to get the money to build out these systems? One thing the Canadian Energy Research Institute is going to be doing soon is putting a overall cost by province to the electricity system and what investment requirements would be needed. And then even if we get the money, will we be able to build it? Recall that Bill C-69 was debated mostly because of its impact on oil and gas pipelines, but it would also impact electricity generation and transmission. And if we are concerned about the ability to build massive energy infrastructure, we should be similarly concerned that this will be the case with the electricity infrastructure build-out that would be required. I mentioned about how will utilities manage uncoordinated home charging? Well, if they can't coordinate the home charging, they're going to have to build a system that's at least twice as big, maybe even bigger. How will governments and businesses deal with stranded costs? We see that all these costs that are built into our gasoline distribution systems would be null and void. Who will own these charging systems? The utilities want to own them now. They're a natural monopoly. Should the utilities own these systems? Should they be in the private sector? Who's going to pay for the risk associated with this public charging stations investment? If we give the utilities direct control, then those costs may be covered by ratepayers. How will governments deal with the loss of gasoline tax revenues? We generated at least $10 billion a year for various levels of governments in the gasoline tax. Are we going to tax electricity? If we tax electricity, is it going to be taxed for all electricity use or just for transportation uses? Keep in mind, nominally, these gasoline taxes are to go into the road network. How will Canada's economy manage the loss of oil and gas investments in excess of $80 to $100 billion a year? Are we going to be eliminating our oil and gas use? Are we going to still be able to use it for export? In the case of Canada's economy, if we drop the full amount, which is the $80 to $100 billion, we won't be able to get that full amount back in the electricity sector, because the electricity sector is mainly focused on domestic demand. There's some exports, but by far, oil and gas sector has much more significant export opportunities than the electricity sector. So we could be in a situation where this loss of the investments in the oil and gas sector can never be made up by any other means. Where will the petrochemical industry go for feedstocks? Right now, the petrochemical industry gets a lot of its feedstocks from the natural gas liquids that are generated in the production of natural gas or methane. Will that still be the case if we see a lot smaller demand for natural gas for domestic consumption? What happens to the petrochemical industry then? One of the advantages of the petrochemical industry is its low feedstock prices. If it doesn't have that and it has to import natural gas liquids, are they still going to be competitive? How do we offset the loss of the royalty payments to governments? Oil and gas is a resource-based activity and generates royalties. electricity is more of a manufacturing process, and it does not. So there's a loss of royalty payments associated with oil and gas. Where are we going to get that money from? How does Canada manage its balance of trade impacts if we eliminate oil and gas for export markets? Keep in mind, the Canadian dollar is very much tied to our economic activities and in the export market. And if we eliminate oil and gas, what does that mean for our Canadian dollar? Is the Canadian dollar going to be undervalued, or are we going to go down to 65 cents versus the American dollar? Now, that might be good for exports in general, but it also means that our productivity improvements in our various industrial activities will get that much harder, because much of the equipment that would be purchased in lower dollar values. And what plans will we need to transition workers from one industry to the other? I mentioned before that the oil and gas sector is focused in a few provinces, while the electricity sector is much more widespread. We have a country where the majority of people don't like to move for jobs. Some do, but most don't. So if we're transitioning workers, can we actually get them to move to another location to work on electricity projects and not on oil and gas projects? These are all unanswered questions. These are all going to add to the costs of the overall CO2 ton costs for moving towards electricity and away from oil and gas. We don't know the answer to these questions right now. There's still a lot to be talked about in terms of moving away from fossil fuels and towards electricity. And then I'm going to leave you with a very provocative slide, and that's this one. What is our economic benchmark? Carbon capture and storage from the atmosphere is being done right now. There's a company out in Squamish, British Columbia, that is working on carbon capture from the atmosphere. And they've quoted that they can do it for $100 a ton of CO2. Now, our analysis suggests that it's probably not at that level, and we put in a wide range of $100 to $230 per ton. But then you'd have to take off the value you would get out of using that CO2 in services like enhanced oil recovery and also carbon fiber manufacturing. In addition to that, CCS from the air is very immature technology, and you would expect, just like we've seen with the lowering of costs for wind power and PVs, solar power, we would see that cost go down. So in terms of carbon capture and storage from the atmosphere, we can see that this number $100 to $230 is likely to decrease. How much? We don't know. On the other hand, electrification as a means to get rid of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions generally, we already know, based on our analysis, that it's going to range from $114 to $124 a ton. Plus, there's all these additional costs that we talked about. What do we do about the stranded costs of gasoline service stations? What do we do about the stranded costs of natural gas distribution systems and transmission systems? All these would add to the overall cost per ton of CO2 equivalent. So in terms of electrification, those costs are going to go up. So they're starting at $114 to $124 and going to go up, and we don't know how far they will go up. In addition to just the pure cost, there's also a significant dislocation of workers in this scenario. As I mentioned, oil and gas workers may not necessarily go into the electricity business because they don't like to go from one province to another. Retail service station employees don't have the same skill sets would be required for moving into the electricity sector. So there's a lot of unanswered questions that we have here. What it means for Canada in the long run? I've got more questions than answers at this point. It means that we have to be very careful about what we're doing in terms of substituting electricity for fossil fuels, especially if the principal target for that is to reduce emissions. And we already see emerging new technologies that can reduce those emissions at least an equivalent price or maybe even cheaper. So do you want to disrupt the Canadian economy and go towards electrification? Or should we be investing more in carbon capture and storage and continuing to use our fossil fuels as they're being used right now? Ladies and gentlemen, that was the last slide for this presentation. I invite your questions at this point. As I mentioned at the beginning, the questions can be submitted via the questions panel on the side of your screen. And if there's any questions that we receive after or we can't answer now, we will follow up with all our participants and provide those answers to you. So at this point, we're looking for questions from the audience. Okay, there's a question here. Volkswagen intends to plead guilty to charges laid under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act after 4-year federal investigation into diesel fuel scandals that has already cost the automaker tens of billions of dollars in their jurisdictions. Here is hoping that the government levies significant fines to deter automakers and others from fraudulent behavior in the future. Environmental Defense is urging Ottawa to use any fines paid by Volkswagen to accelerate the country's transition to a cleaner economy, including the building an electric vehicle charging network. Given the low adoption rate of electric vehicles to date, would this be the best use of those funds, or do you suggest an alternative? Well, at this point, I would say that we don't have enough information to suggest one thing or another. I would say that if we can do some of the electrification activities that are lower cost, we might want to consider that at the same time as investing in carbon capture and storage from the atmosphere. Some of the electrification activities will likely be at a lower cost than what we've got in terms of the overall cost of $114 to $124 a ton. That's one of the questions that we're going to be looking at in the future. But if we were to go, 100% into electrification, I would be cautious of that given the significant cost implications that it has. We're in a situation where we've got uncertainty, and the uncertainty associated with which path we should take or multiple paths we should take is significant. Do we want to experiment with our economy with new policies that may have unintended consequences? That's an interesting question, and it's one that we're trying to answer one piece at a time. While you're thinking about other questions, oh, here we go. Are we looking at a significant political upheaval to achieve the electricity economy described seems to require a national energy plan, which has traditionally created significant angst? Well, you note that one of my questions to the audience was, are we willing to have a very interventionist policy in order to move forward in terms for electrification? We haven't in the past for almost anything. I don't recall anything in our recent past that would be at the same scale and magnitude as what we're talking about here. Do we want our federal and provincial governments to be managing all those activities for us, or do we want to take a more incremental approach? The next question I have here, have you done any analysis on what form of electricity generation will be needed to meet GHG reduction commitments? nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, and other renewables versus natural gas? Yes, we have. We've looked at the costs of all these things. Keep in mind that we're not advocating for one role or another, one position or another. We're just trying to identify the costs and some of the implications. And what we found in terms of electricity generation is that for the most part, all the generation options are in the same range of about 7 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And that'll vary based on the province and taxes and things of that nature. But wind and solar are competitive with natural gas. In fact, the cheapest option right now is biomass. But the problem with biomass is it's got limited capacity. We can only get about 500 megawatts per jurisdiction in biomass, so you'd have to look at others. But what we've seen is that electricity prices where wind, for example, is firmed up with natural gas can be in the 7-cent range. So that's firm power at 7 cents. Will the increased demand for electricity to charge vehicles be generated with natural gas, and how much increased demand for natural gas do you expect from this generation? Well, if we're looking at the electrification scenario, the amount of natural gas needed will go down. It will go down significantly. Do we know if it's going to be more than half or larger than that? That's an unanswered question. In our analysis, the way we conducted the assessment was we made assumptions that the electricity would come primarily from non-emitting sources. So renewables, solar, wind, as well as hydroelectricity and some nuclear where it already exists. We haven't added in any new nuclear capacity. So the much of the electricity that will be generated will be zero emissions. Now we're already in a situation in Canada where our grid is over 80% non-emitting. As we move to retire our coal plants, that non-emitting percentage will go up, likely to 90%. So Canada will have a fairly clean grid. So it works for us. It works for us in Canada. Does it work for other countries? Who knows? A lot of other countries don't have the same high percentage of non-emitting sources. A lot of them still use a lot of natural gas and coal, and in some cases oil. So what does that mean? It will be interesting to see how it affects other countries. But in this case, the natural gas demand for Canada is likely to go down because we're talking about not having natural gas being used for homes, not having natural gas being used for commercial buildings. And while we don't have the analysis reflected here, we would also be assuming that a lot of natural gas would be removed from industrial demand. And when you look at the use of natural gas, the byproducts, the natural gas liquids, they are very valuable to this country. They've created a petrochemical sector, which has a significant benefit to Canada, in particular in Ontario and Alberta. And would we still be able to get those natural gas liquids in the quantity and at the price that we get them now? The likely answer to that is no. It's not certain, but I can't see those natural gas liquids being available to the same extent as they are now. Another point, I'll just raise a point to see if there's anyone has questions, is if we look at the stranded costs associated with the gasoline retail sector and the natural gas sector, we're talking about significant investments that have been made over time. And I'll just take you to the one, which is the gasoline retail sector. Not only will the assets for those facilities be zero value, they will immediately have to be cleaned up by the owners in order to bring those sites back into a more environmentally pristine situation. So that means that the retail service sector is not only going to get hit by stranded assets, it's going to get a bill for cleanup, because they'll have to clean those stations up once they have been shut down. Is this study assuming renewable resources are enough to produce all the electricity required to move towards electrification? Yes and no. I mean, there is sufficient renewable resources in Canada to provide the electricity. We've done a detailed study looking at wind and solar and hydro, and for the most part, those the demands that we're talking about can be met. But I'll give you a for instance. Let's say that you're looking at building a new power station. A newer power station that was fueled on natural gas would be the same size as a Costco outlet store. That same capacity would need to be 5 to 7 kilometers square for a wind generation site. That's a big difference when it comes to land use impacts. Are people going to want that? We've seen in Ontario a huge backlash against wind projects in particular. Now, if we were to do that across the country, what would people's reactions be? Would they want to see a wind turbine right next to their house? Not likely. How can our energy intensive and trade exposed industries manage this transition if the US does not transition at the same pace? Well, that's the challenge. The challenge has been recognized by different levels of government by allowing these trade exposed companies to get an offset to, in this case, what I'm talking about is the carbon tax. So sometimes that offset could be 80% and it could be up to 100%. We could see a situation here where we have the majority of the Canadian marketplace going towards electrification and leaving the trade exposed industries alone. But then the question becomes, especially for natural gas, is because industry uses a lot of natural gas. If we don't have the domestic demand in terms of the commercial or residential loads to offset some of the costs for natural gas to industry, because each pays a portion of the overall cost of the system, is the natural gas costs in Canada then go up to such a point as it creates a negative competitive impact on our trade exposed industries? Can't say that right now. It's very difficult. It's very complex. And the point I always stress is we need to take our time. We should really consider which options we can do. We don't have to go as fast and as quick as some people would want. We can take a much more incremental approach and then stop and look around and see what's happened. If we go forward with electrification in a great hurry, we have significant impacts that we're going to have to deal with. So in terms of trade exposed industries, I would say that governments have recognized that there is an issue for them, and they've done something about it in terms of other regulations, in particular the carbon tax. I don't see why they wouldn't do the same thing for any issues around electrification. That was it for questions. I'm just going to pause and see if there's anything more. Oh, carbon leakage is a risk when we do have one. Carbon leakage is a risk when comparing two neighboring jurisdictions that do not have similar policy drivers. Can you comment? Yes, carbon leakage is an issue. I would look at it in terms of investment leakage because it's not just about a carbon tax. It's about the whole investment environment in a particular jurisdiction versus another one. What we found in some of our analysis is that certainty makes a big difference. So even if there are higher costs, if there's a higher degree of certainty in terms of the fiscal and policy environment, and that may be enough. In addition to that, various companies make their investment based on incentives from governments. We see that in the petrochemical sector very significantly, that it is by far the biggest indicator of where a company is going to make an investment if they get an incentive. So while carbon leakage may be a problem, I look at the investment environment holistically, and it's not just one policy, it is many. And if there's a higher carbon tax in one jurisdiction versus another, but there is lower corporate taxes and access to markets and cheap feedstocks and a reliable workforce, those are also significant factors. Dr. Moore indicates that CO2 at 60 parts per million, there will not be enough food for all of us. Perhaps this is a reason for not moving to new technologies. If we're talking about 60 parts per million in the atmosphere, I don't see how that's ever going to happen. Where right now we've crossed 400 parts per million, and it took us 150 years to get here. Will we ever get down to 60 parts per million? I would say the answer to that is a definite no. So I'm not sure that this statement about a worry about food based on 60 parts per million in the atmosphere is valid at all. We have very much solutions and processes to generate food, and 60 parts per million of CO2 is probably the least of the challenges that people are talking about these days. One of the other questions I didn't put on the list, and I'll just raise it for the group now as they consider other questions to submit, is the disruption at the household level. If you're talking about increasing the electricity requirements in a home, do your homes have sufficient capacity to build that additional demand? We haven't even touched on the fact about what the investment would be at the household level. How much is your furnace? So you're going to have to replace your furnace if we go towards electrification. Do we replace it with an electric forced air furnace, or do you replace it with baseboard heaters? Electric heating is much more expensive than natural gas heating. So we're not only talking about the economy as a whole, but individual households regarding how much they're going to have to spend on heat. We already know, you read in the paper about various communities and people that have electric heating that are suffering significant affordability issues because of the higher price of electricity compared to natural gas. China is building, and here's another question, China is building or planning to build 300 coal plants as widely spread as Turkey, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Egypt, and the Philippines. How do we globally change so we all work together to reduce greenhouse gases? Well, that's a good question. If I knew the answer to that one, I'd probably be at the UN. I think this is one of those broad challenges that's going to take a long time, and a lot of talk, a lot of investment, and a lot of compromise. So what is China doing right now? They're focusing on economic development. And a lot of these jurisdictions, they need the power to support their economies. So when we look at Canada versus some of these emerging countries, in particular, Bangladesh and maybe Vietnam, they have different issues than what we have in Canada. So can we do something that they can't right now? Absolutely. Are they relying on traditional sources in order to manage other issues, such as affordability and the availability of power? Of course they are. Can we require them to do the same things we're doing? Well, that's a good question, but consider this. We're in a much better situation in terms of affordable and reliable and sustainable electric power than any of these countries that have been mentioned. Does that mean that we all have to go in the same direction at the same time? That's an interesting question. I don't have the answer to that one. I do know that China is trying to reduce its own domestic reliance on coal, but it's doing so in a way where it's not necessarily growing the coal generation at a fast pace, but maintaining it and allowing other sources to overtake the growth requirements. So China has been domestically been in about a 65% range for coal-fired electricity generation. And their 5-year plan, which is supposed to end next year, is supposed to bring that down to 60%. So even in a situation where they've got a greenhouse gas management plan, they're still going to be using a lot of coal power. Poland is another example. Poland's been given an exemption from the EU to continue to use coal-fired electricity generation for the foreseeable future. They're 85% coal. When we look at Canada compared to these other countries, we're in a much stronger position to manage and maintain a lower greenhouse gas emissions footprint. Does that mean we shouldn't do that because other countries can't? And that's a political question. And we're not in the business of answering those political questions. We just pose the questions and look for ways to provide information to decision makers in government and in business and in the broader public to make good decisions. There is general consensus that something needs to be done about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What needs to be done and when and by who and how much, that's still up in the air. For the time being, though, I think that Canada needs to understand its obligations a lot better, with a lot more detail on what the consequences could be. Here's another question that came in. Has the cost of not taking action to reduce carbon emissions been considered? Most countries are changing to EVs and have set targets to completely get rid of fossil fuel driven vehicles. Why shouldn't Canada set similar targets? Well, I'll answer these in parts. Has the cost of not taking action to reduce carbon emissions been considered? Well, in the presentation I've been making, I am not suggesting that Canada shouldn't take action. My point is we should consider what are the cheapest ways to take action. And so the cost of not taking action is not relevant to that part of the discussion. Most countries are changing to EVs and have set targets to completely get rid of fossil fuel driven vehicles. Why shouldn't Canada set similar targets? Sure, Canada can set similar targets. How much does it cost? Are there other options that are cheaper? We're not talking here about not doing something. What we're talking about here is what is the cheapest way of doing something, right? So have these other countries looked at the cost associated with getting off of fossil fuel vehicles versus other things? I haven't seen any analysis on that. We're not talking about not doing something. I'll repeat that again. This is really an issue about doing the best we can for the cheapest we can. So are fossil fuel vehicles better than electric vehicles? Not necessarily. Are electric vehicles better than fossil fuel vehicles? Not necessarily. You want China to go forward with moving all their vehicles off gasoline and towards electricity? And I just noted that they will still have 60% of their electricity generated by coal. And if you do the numbers, a coal-fired electricity generation produces more greenhouse gas emissions for an electric vehicle than a gasoline vehicle does. Is that something we want to do? In Poland, same thing, 85% coal-fired generation. Do we want to have electric vehicles in Poland? They're going to stay at 85% for the foreseeable future. Are we going to be selling Teslas and Leafs in Poland so that we can actually increase carbon emissions? That's the issue here. The issue is, let's think about the different options and not just run off and say we're going to do X or Y without understanding what it means. In Canada, we can do that. In Canada, we can move away from gasoline to electric vehicles and achieve a lower emissions target. Can other countries? Norway, maybe? Can the United States? They're still significantly on coal. China, as I mentioned. Other countries? Do we even know if they're actually going to do better in terms of carbon emissions if they go to electric vehicles? And the answer to that is no. France will be able to because they're 90% nuclear. So pick your country, do the analysis, and see if it actually makes sense. And then see if there's other ways you can do it for cheaper. And my argument here is we should be looking at all the ways we can reduce emissions and using the cheapest options, and not just going after one policy that suggests we should do it this way without considering what the costs are. When I go grocery shopping, I just don't blindly put things in my cart. I look at how much it costs. People are concerned about how much it costs. It's just after 10. We've got no additional questions here. I'm going to wait just a couple of minutes and then we'll close it for the day. Just one last thing here is we have a couple of seminars coming up in January. We have a webinar on industrial competitiveness, productivity, and energy efficiency. So if you think about managing our greenhouse gas emissions, this is one way. However, if you're in a province that has a high percentage of non-emitting sources, then energy efficiency just should be looked at as a financial option, not an environmental one. Then later in January, we're going to be looking at the role of rail in Canada's crude and petrochemical markets. And we had a real reminder of the vital role that rail has just recently with the strike we had for a few days, and that put everyone's plans in turmoil. Canada's economy is dependent on our rail system. How is this going to help Canada move forward with its crude and petrochemical markets? So we're going to be providing that in January. A couple of other studies we're working on right now include the value added products that can be generated out of oil and gas from non-combustion sources or non-combustion processes, as well as the business case for distributed energy resources. We're trying to answer questions as best we can as we go along, and hopefully the library of material that we're generating can allow people to see the broader comprehensive nature of our energy systems and make better choices. With that, if there's no other questions, no other questions are coming in. So thank you very much. Very much appreciate your attention to this matter. And if you have follow-up questions later, you can always contact us at info@ceri.ca. Thank you.